Next Tuesday in Holby City.
Get out of the car.
Don't be ridiculous!
You cut me up!
Oh.
He's always demanded an exceptional standard.
First day back, I could kill my boss.
Now his life depends on it.
Scalpel.
Holby City, the new series, starts next Tuesday at 8 on BBC One.
Come on, guys, I don't want to lose him.
Some people
I wouldn't buy it if I were you. The house won't like you.
will do anything
No more fish in the airing cupboard, and no more flatulent goats in the bathroom.
for a simple life in the country. Down to Earth continues this Sunday at 8 on BBC One.
This is BBC One in London and the South East. Now at 10 o'clock, the BBC News with Peter Sissons and Emily Matlis.
Tony Blair tells the Taliban we're ready to drive you from power. And it could be the first act of many for the New World community. Don't forget the Euro, Blair revives talk of a referendum. And on student loans, he comes close to admitting he's got it wrong. Also tonight, Swiss Air leaves thousands stranded as it runs out of cash. No apologies, the Earl brushes off questions about his TV company and Prince William's privacy.
And later on BBC London News, the overworked debt collectors chasing £100 million in unpaid fines, and a wake-up call to the NHS, the man who died after 9 hours on a hospital trolley.
Good evening. Tony Blair prepared the country today for a massive armed offensive in Afghanistan that would drive the Taliban from power. He said there could be no diplomacy and no compromise with those who harboured terrorists. But his speech at Labour's conference in Brighton was notable for a whole new vision he set out of the international forces now united against terror going on to settle conflicts and reduce suffering throughout the world. The main points of Mr. Blair's speech on the Taliban, he said their finances, military hardware and troops would be targeted, but not civilians. The new international resolve could also be used to tackle trouble spots in Africa and even defeat climate change. On the euro, he said Britain should have the courage to hold a referendum inside 5 years if the economic tests are met. And on the public services, controversial reforms would go on. The status quo was the enemy. Andrew Marr, in Brighton, watched the Prime Minister's speech.
3 weeks ago, in this hotel, Tony Blair watched with horrified astonishment the pictures of the World Trade Center attack. Today, in the speech of his lifetime, he responded with a vision of a new and better world order. Hugely ambitious, intensely argued, it was listened to not only by Labour in Brighton, but halfway round the world. It prepared us for war against the Taliban of Afghanistan, also for a war against hunger. But it began nearer to home, with the memorial service for British victims in New York.
And it was in many ways a very British occasion. Tea and biscuits raining outside and around the edge of the room, strangers making small talk, trying to be normal people in a very abnormal situation. And then a middle-aged mother looks you in the eyes and tells you that her only son has died and asks you why. And I tell you, you do not feel like the most powerful man in the country at times like that.
But he is, and part of his job is to reassure a pretty jittery country.
I know that people here in Britain are anxious, even a little frightened. I understand that. People know we must act, but they worry what might follow. Our way of life is a great deal stronger and will last a great deal longer than the actions of fanatics, small in number and now facing a unified world against them. People should have confidence. This is a battle with only one outcome: our victory, not theirs.
And the they is the Taliban, not just Osama bin Laden and his people. Diplomatic language doesn't come any blunter than this.
As for the Taliban, they can surrender the terrorists or face the consequences. And again, in any action, the aim will be to eliminate their military hardware, cut off their finances, disrupt their supplies, target their troops, not civilians. We will put a trap around the regime. And I say to the Taliban, surrender the terrorists or surrender power. That is your choice.
What follows, he said, could be a world remade, one in which we didn't ever again walk away from the wretched of Afghanistan, or Rwanda, or the Congo, or any of the places the rich world has shrugged off for so long.
The state of Africa is a scar on the conscience of the world. But if the world as a community focused on it, we could heal it. The starving, the wretched, the dispossessed, the ignorant, those living in want and squalor, from the deserts of northern Africa to the slums of Gaza to the mountain regions of Afghanistan, they too are our cause.
These are intensely felt words that will be remembered around the world, and against which one day this Prime Minister will be measured. But well before that, there's another more divisive choice coming over the Euro referendum, and it sounds as if he's moving on that as well. Listen for the key word here: courage.
We should only be part of the single currency if the economic conditions are met. They are not window dressing for a political decision. They are fundamental. But if they are met, we should join, and if met in this Parliament, we should have the courage of our argument to ask the British people for their consent in this Parliament.
Bold words, partly because Mr. Blair is well aware of the extra political authority this crisis has loaned him, and he intends to use it on the euro, public sector reform and much else. Indeed, he's so confident he attacked head-on the traditional anti-Americanism of some parts of the Labour left in ferocious terms. Shameful ignorance, he said.
I think of a black man, born in poverty, who became chief of their armed forces and is now Secretary of State, Colin Powell, and I wonder, frankly, whether such a thing could have happened here. Yes, America has its faults, but it is a free country, a democracy. It is our ally. And some of the reaction to the 11th of September betrays a hatred of America that shames those that feel it.
This is not a man who minces words anymore. In the old political phrase, Tony Blair has become a leader who wants to make the political weather. Out of disaster, he has discovered impatience.
This is a moment to seize. The kaleidoscope has been shaken. The pieces are in flux. Soon they will settle again. Before they do, let us reorder this world around us.
That message, one the Prime Minister converts here, he'd be amazed at. No razzmatazz, no cheers, but he has Labour almost completely united behind him. And yet speeches, however good, are the easy part. Mr. Blair left quickly. He's got some lonely nights to come. Andrew Marr, BBC News, Brighton.
The Prime Minister's comments on the chances of a referendum on the euro during this Parliament were welcomed by supporters of the single currency, but opponents pointed out that opinion polls were still heavily against and that raising the subject in present circumstances was unnecessarily divisive. Our economics editor Evan Davis reports.
Any more? Would you like to sign up, sir? Yeah, why not?
The Euro referendum campaign started today in Brighton, or at least that's one interpretation of the Prime Minister's speech. There was certainly campaigning on the sidelines of the Labour conference, the Yes team and the rival No team nearby. But they didn't see eye to eye on what the Prime Minister was saying.
I was delighted by what the Prime Minister had to say today. It was a very wide-ranging speech, talking about the principles of international cooperation. And it was in that context that he talked about the prospects of British entry in the single currency. I think that that's fundamental to Britain's new role in the world.
I don't think there's any change from the policy that was set out in October 1997. And actually, with the world economy more uncertain than it has been for the whole time that New Labour's been in power, I think this is not the time that they would rush into the euro.
In truth, the decision on the euro all comes back to 5 key tests the government's using to see whether we should join, whether our economy has converged with those of Europe, whether we're flexible enough to cope with future problems, and whether the euro is good for investment, the financial services industry, and finally for employment. But passing these tests is no done deal. The Chancellor says they have to be passed in a clear and unambiguous way, and that's a challenging hurdle for this Parliament. The pound would have to fall before we passed any of these tests. It fell a little today, a sign perhaps the city thought the chance of the pound joining was now a little more likely.
there had been a belief that with the UK standing shoulder to shoulder with the US through this tragedy, that maybe we were distancing ourselves a bit from the continent and moving closer to the US. Prime Minister Blair's reiteration of EMU and the importance of joining it at some stage very much quashed that belief.
But if the Prime Minister was trying to link the euro, an event since September the 11th, he won't get support from the opposition.
It is an issue which divides people, and so I was surprised at this particular moment when, we are looking all to hold together in the face of what is a very serious international situation, that he should actually bring this up.
But with new euro notes circulating in January, the debate will come to feel less abstract. Centimetre by centimetre, a decision on the euro is moving closer. Evan Davis, BBC News.
And our political editor, Andrew Marr, is at the Labour conference in Brighton now. Andrew, first of all, this vision of the new international coalition with its own moral battalions, is it now official government policy? Has it ever, for instance, been put before a cabinet meeting?
It's never been put before a cabinet meeting, partly because it's been something that has been developing in Tony Blair's head over the last few weeks in response to the events of September the 11th. It is his grand vision. He's talked about Africa before, but it's something in its scope and its restless ambition that has come as something of a surprise to the Labour Party, and rather a happy surprise as far as this party is concerned. Tonight, the Tribune rally, that's the left-wing rally, whose kind of normal function at a Labour Party conference is to attack the leader of the day in the most offensive and vituperative terms possible, particularly if the leader's Tony Blair, is almost like a Tony Blair fan club. They like it. So it's not just the world order that's being remade, it's the Labour Party order as well.
Now, he didn't have to mention the euro today. Is this a man with another mission who's made up his mind that his destiny is to take Britain in?
Yeah, I think he has this new authority which has arrived as a result of these awful events. It's almost as if he's sort of levitated above the rest of the Labour Party movement, and he is determined to press ahead in every area where he has a big agenda. Now, nothing is more important to him than the euro, and I think this referendum is coming in this Parliament now.
Andrew Marr for the moment, thank you. The airline Swissair tonight stands on the brink of total collapse. The company's planes have been grounded and it's not clear when or if they'll start flying again. The airline is in rescue talks with its bankers, but as our business editor Jeff Randall reports, it's not the only carrier facing severe financial problems.
Goodbye, Swissair. This was the airline's last flight out of London today before all its planes were grounded. The heavily indebted carrier has finally run out of cash and can no longer pay for fuel or landing fees. Its passengers have been left stranded all around the world, like these at Geneva Airport.
I've got the tickets, flight has been cancelled, and we're queuing up to see where we can get to in England at the moment.
They just told me to stand in line and see what comes about.
Once the pride of European aviation with a reputation for outstanding service, Swissair has been brought down by overambitious expansion.
Swissair was trying to be a global carrier on the basis of a relatively small home market and trying to fly more or less everywhere and hub passengers through Zurich. And that was a strategy that was unsustainable because they just couldn't get enough passengers to fill their seats at tariffs that were high enough to cover the cost.
Swissair's in deep trouble, but it's not alone in clocking up huge losses. Last year, the Swissair Group slumped more than £1 billion into the red. Its partner airline, Sabena of Belgium, lost £210 million. Greece's Olympic has yet to publish results, but is estimated to have lost £130 million last year. While in Ireland, Aer Lingus says it could lose up to £50 million this year. It seems Europe has too many airlines chasing too few passengers.
Consolidation is long overdue in Europe among the airlines. Probably something like half a dozen major carriers could handle the traffic and could manage it more successfully, more profitably, and more satisfactorily in many cases for the passengers themselves.
Loss-making British Airways would also welcome fewer competitors, but state aid is keeping many of its rivals alive.
Swissair is by no means the only European airline facing bankruptcy. And with Europe coming together on many other fronts, some countries would like to abandon their state-owned flag carriers altogether. It makes sense financially, but few are prepared to pay the political cost of heavy job losses. Jeff Randall, BBC News, Heathrow.
The US Federal Reserve, America's central bank, cut a key interest rate by 0.5 percentage point tonight to its lowest level since 1962. The Fed said that the attacks on New York and Washington had significantly heightened uncertainty in the already weak US economy and indicated they would be prepared to cut rates still further. In Washington, meanwhile, the Defense Secretary announced that he would fly to the Middle East tonight for talks on America's fight against terrorism with regional leaders.
For 3 weeks, Washington's Reagan Airport, just a mile from the Pentagon, has been off-limits, closed for security reasons. Today, the president's motorcade rolled onto the runway to signal its reopening. His arrival a huge relief to Washington's business leaders. They were looking for reassurance, and they got it.
There really is no greater symbol that America's back in business than the reopening of this airport.
Just yards away, though, the terminal's still silent and empty. It won't reopen till new security measures are in place. There's just one sign of an economy still reeling from the shock of September the 11th. On Capitol Hill today, officials had this gloomy assessment.
There's an indication of a modest recession fueled by a decline in confidence in equity values.
Soon after, Wall Street got the news it expected. The Federal Reserve shaved another 0.5% off interest rates. It prompted a mild rally on the markets. Here at the Federal Reserve, they've done what they can to stave off recession. Interest rates are at a 40-year low. But the real economic problem now isn't the cost of borrowing money. It's the slide in consumer confidence and the general air of uncertainty. Of course, Wall Street itself is just blocks away from the wreckage of the World Trade Center, and the nation's primary focus remains the fight against terror. At the White House, the president, less forceful than Tony Blair, said the Taliban must hand over bin Laden and his associates.
There's no negotiations. There's no calendar. We'll act on our time.
Significantly, the president, for the first time today, talked of a Palestinian state, words which will please Arab countries in his anti-terror coalition and which may help keep it together.
You know, the idea of a Palestinian state has always been in a part of a vision, so long as the right to Israel to exist is respected.
The U.S. military today showcasing its multiple launch rocket system. But the hardware alone won't vanquish the terrorists. The president is engaged in a sophisticated diplomatic effort, which will have consequences in the Middle East as well as Afghanistan. Stephen Sacker, BBC News, Washington.
And there are reports tonight that at least 2 Israelis have been killed after Palestinian gunmen attacked a house in the Jewish settlement of Alei Sinai in the Gaza Strip. Yasser Arafat, leader of the Palestinian Authority, strongly condemned the attack. The Israeli Prime Minister Ariel Sharon has called an emergency meeting of his security cabinet tomorrow. America has flatly rejected an appeal by Afghanistan's Taliban rulers to negotiate with them. The Taliban's ambassador to Pakistan told journalists that negotiations were the only way to avoid conflict. NATO said today it had now seen clear and compelling evidence of Osama bin Laden's involvement in last month's attacks.
The Taliban sense an attack on them is now imminent, and today their ambassador to Pakistan offered negotiations to defuse the crisis. But he said they still won't hand over Osama bin Laden without proof of his guilt.
We want justice. We don't want to surrender that without any proof, any evidence. Where is the evidence? Where is the proof? We cannot able to do that.
But in Brussels today, NATO said it's been given proof by the Americans that bin Laden and his al-Qaeda network are guilty.
The facts are clear and compelling. The information presented points conclusively to an al-Qaeda role in the 11th of September attacks.
But no one was talking tougher today about bin Laden than the Russian President Vladimir Putin, currently on a visit to Belgium. He said terrorist groups are like parasites who live off countries which are free. Terrorists are like bacteria, said Mr. Putin. They adapt very well to the organism they're living on. And he added that Russia and its intelligence services do not need any extra proof that bin Laden is guilty. Tonight, more American warships are heading for the region. Ominously, Washington says the Taliban's offer to negotiate is merely an attempt to delay. Ben Brown, BBC News.
The Prime Minister also told the Labour conference today that there's to be a review of student financing. He said the government had to find a better way than the current system. Our education correspondent Mike Baker joins me from Brighton. Mike, that sounds like code for an admission that the policy on student finance is a mess.
Because I think it is an admission that the policy is not working out as the government hoped it would. I think ministers will want to stick to the principle that those who can afford to pay something towards the cost of the university should continue to do so. But what they've had to accept is that those young people from less well-off homes are being put off by the prospect of debt from going to university. And quite simply, if they don't get those young people into university, the government won't meet Tony Blair's target for expanding universities.
What aspect of the system is the prime candidate for change or abandonment even? I mean, and could they simply adopt the Scottish system?
I don't think it's as simple as that. I think it is a big review. It's not just a matter of detail. The Education Secretary, who's leading this review, will want to ask key questions such as who should pay what and most crucially when. And I think that's what we're likely to see, moving away from the current upfront payment of tuition fees towards some sort of payment after you've graduated, some sort of graduate tax, alongside an reintroduction of grants, although they'll prefer to call them bursaries, to help with the living costs for students who have less money.
Mike Baker, thank you. Children as young as 12 may be given nicotine patches to help them stop smoking. The therapy is to be tried out in Nottingham and, if successful, could be introduced nationwide. Our science correspondent Fergus Walsh reports.
This is the start of a lifelong habit for many youngsters. Nicotine is as addictive as heroin or cocaine, and it's Britain's biggest health problem. The figures are staggering. In the UK, it's estimated that 450 children a day start smoking. By the age of 15, 1 in 4 smokes regularly. Of those who want to stop, 2/3 fail to kick the habit. Cigarettes are easy for youngsters to get hold of. Nicotine patches are not. So now they'll be supplied free by a youth project in Nottingham to see if they can help children beat their addiction.
We know that young people become dependent on nicotine just as adults do. The vast majority of young people here will be between 14 and 16, but we have ethics committee approval to go down to the age of 12. And the aim is to see whether counselling plus nicotine replacement therapy actually helps young people give up.
Tobacco still kills 120,000 people a year. Smoking among teenagers is as popular now as it was 20 years ago. And doctors say unless that changes, they will become the health statistics of the future. Fergus Walsh, BBC News.
A group of anti-noise campaigners has won its case in the European Court of Human Rights against nighttime flights at Heathrow Airport. The verdict could mean there'll be a significant reduction in the number of night flights at other UK airports. Campaigners argued that aircraft noise breached their right to a good night's sleep. The government has 3 months to appeal against the ruling. The judge has begun summing up in the trial of Michael Stone. He denies murdering Lynn and Megan Russell and the attempted murder of Josie Russell. The jury at Nottingham Crown Court was warned the case rests solely on the evidence of one witness who alleges Stone confessed to the killings. Prince Edward has made his first public appearance since his television production company was accused of infringing Prince William's privacy at university in Scotland. He was dogged by the issue as he toured schools and community projects in the Midlands and finally made only the briefest of comments, which wasn't an apology.
Today, the filmmaker reverted to Prince, and it was his turn to face the cameras and the questions.
Prince Edward, will you be giving up your business now?
Morning. Rarely has a visit by Edward proved such a media attraction, and though he ignored the questions at first, he soon made it clear that he thought the row surrounding his TV company's behaviour was over.
No, I haven't. Thank you very much. Thank you very much indeed. No, we've said all that's been said, and I don't think there's any need to say anything more. Thank you very much indeed.
But there are issues still to be resolved. As yet, Ardent has refused to rule out making further programmes about royalty. It's an assurance that would help set minds at rest at Buckingham Palace. So, as Edward continued the routine business of being a prince, I asked him whether he was planning to make more royal programmes.
Edward, are you going to go on making programmes about royalty?
There was nothing more to say, he replied. But the press officer decided that the media had already said enough and abruptly shooed the cameras away. Throughout the day, as Edward inspected projects to do with the Duke of Edinburgh's award scheme, the press were kept at arm's length and photo opportunities were strictly limited. But still the questions kept coming, and in the end, the Prince decided to set the record straight about whether there'd be any apologies.
No apologies, I'm not being rude, I'm not going to say anything more on the matter. Thank you very much indeed.
It had, he said, been a most interesting day, but it was one on which he got a taste of the intense scrutiny he's now put himself and his business under by rocking the royal boat so violently. Jenny Bond, BBC News, Birmingham.
Now more on tonight's main news, Tony Blair's ultimatum to the Taliban and his vision of even wider intervention by a new world community. I'm joined again from the Labour conference in Brighton by our political editor Andrew Marr and from Washington by Stephen Sacker. Stephen, in Washington, how has Tony Blair's talk of a new world community gone down in Washington? Is George Bush in on it?
No, I don't think he's in on the grand ambition. Basically, I think what you have here is a partnership between Blair and Bush, which, quite frankly, is very useful to both. But we shouldn't be misled into believing this is a political match made in heaven. They have different agendas and different styles. And when Tony Blair talked about his grand, idealistic vision, his internationalism, I think George Bush would be scratching his head, quite frankly, because George Bush sees this as a specific war on terror. He's not into nation building. And what Tony Blair was talking about, particularly in Afghanistan and in Africa as well, sounded suspiciously to many Americans, including some in the Bush administration, like nation building, something the Americans do not want to embark on.
Stephen Sacker, thank you. Andrew Marr, one commentator wrote this morning about Prime Minister Bush and President Blair. Are there risks for Tony Blair with his apparent presidential style?
Yes, there certainly are. He has almost detached himself from many of his colleagues, and he is pitching for world leadership at a level that very few British leaders have done before. But with that ambition comes enormous risk. As one of his colleagues who loved this speech said to me, it was marvellous. But never forget that one cruise missile arriving in a refugee camp could change it all. We could be looking back on this with embarrassment rather than pride. That, of course, is the risk.
Andrew Marr, thank you. It's just about 27 minutes past 10. I'll be back a little later with an update on the day's headlines, but now we join our news teams across the United Kingdom.
Good evening, this is BBC London News. London's courts are struggling to deal with a mountain of unpaid fines totalling £100 million. There used to be 400 police officers to chase up fines. Now there are just 57 civilians who don't even have the power of arrest. This evening, the Lord Chancellor's Department told us ministers are considering ways to improve the collection rate.